So thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. What I will do is a review of what are the major developments that we have been seeing in the global food market. Major focus on the staples, but also talking about high-value commodities, which are fruits, vegetables, meat, and fish. So the presentation is divided in 5 sections: developing global food markets, supply chain disruptions, policy responses, risk and uncertainties, and lessons learned and conclusions. So the first thing to understand is that we are at 96 points in August of the food price index of FAO, which is still down 30% from its February 2011 peak. So it's important to understand this because if we compare for each of the commodities and for the aggregate index relative to the peak, like the global food price index of FAO is minus 30% with respect to the peak, which was in February 2011. In cereals, which the peak was in June 2008, we are still 38% under it. In oils, which was in February 2011, the peak, we are minus 44%. In sugar, minus 56%. In meat, minus 22%. And in dairy, which the peak was in February 2014, we are in minus 35%. So prices are not at the highest level. They have been evolving and increasing for certain reasons I will explain, but they are basically stable. And we expect that in the future, prices should be settled down because of the recession that we are going to be entering. So food prices measured by the FAO price index fell during the first 5 months of the year. And by May 2020, it registered a 17-month low, but food prices started to rise since June. And this is because of some of the pressures of some of the restocking and some of the pressures on feedstock that are happening today. But also rising prices were supported by the slide in the US exchange and some rebound in demand. So the exchange rate is playing a crucial role. In the first month, we saw a dollar which was strong. Now we are observing a dollar which is weak. And that, of course, is creating changes in prices, which means that for net importing countries, it's cheaper to import, but you lose competitiveness in terms of exports. And also means, like for indebted countries, that they can pay better their debt. But again, our expectation is that as things evolve and as all the monetary plans of the countries in the north start to push even more, and the situation could change again to what we were facing before. This is just to look at the exchange rate and how it has evolved. If you compare April to August, look at the reds, which were negatives, so weakening of the dollar, and now the positives, the greens. No? So that's exactly what I was saying. There was a significant change between April and August, which is reflecting what we are observing today in the food prices. If we look at the overall COVID-19 pandemic and how it has worked on the investment flows on wheat, maize, rice, and soybeans, we see that the movements on investment flows remain largely stable. Basically, look at the red line and look at the blue and the green, they're mostly stable. In recent weeks, the managed money, which is the red line, trimmed its small net short for wheat and reduced its net short for maize by half, while increasing its net long for soybeans. And commercials continue to maintain their standard net short positions in wheat and soybeans, while reversing the temporary net long in short term in maize. What we will be observing, because of the depletion of the stocks of pork for China, is that they will start demanding more pork meat, and that will put some pressure on soybeans and other inputs of feedstock. And that's why we are observing lately some increase in prices. Now, what is the cereal situation today? And this is very important to have it very clear. This is something that we have been working intensively with the Agricultural Market Information System. The production is heading towards to another record. It's 2,765 million tons, up 58 million tons year to year. Maize and rice outputs are forecast to reach new records, but a small production decline is expected for wheat, but it's because of the problems facing the EU. Utilization is forecast to 2,746 million tons, up to 2.4% year to year, which means that the stocks even will continue to rise. So stocks by the close of the 2021 season are projected to increase by 1.7% year to year. And in the graph that you can observe here, you will see the evolution of the stocks. And also you can see the production and utilization. So we have a very good utilization rate, but we have significant stocks. This is completely different to what we faced in 2007, 2008, where the major problems was very low stocks, and therefore we couldn't handle the situation of the droughts that were happening, which create a supply shock in that time, in that period of time. Today we have significant shocks. Although one risk, and it's important to alert, is that a significant part of this share of the stocks is an increase in the stocks from China, which has been increasing over time. There is also the other countries have increased their stocks, but China has been the one increasing the most. So again, we have some level of concentration in who is the owner of those stocks, which depends also on how will be the restocking policy of China in the next year to see how much pressure will be in the market. Although a pressure to the market of food prices and staple will be good at this point because the recession is supposed to make prices decline, which will be bad for producers. So some little pressure could help to stabilize even more prices. This is just the stock-to-use ratio for cereals, and it indicates a relatively comfortable supply and demand prospects. The forecast is 31.8 of world stock-to-use ratio, and the major exporter stocks-to-disappearance ratio is 19.1. So this is down slightly from the last year, the cereal stock-to-use ratio, and the lowest in 4 years, but it's still relatively high from historical perspective. So how we can summarize the world of the staples, which is the first shock and what we were concerned at the beginning of the COVID-19, because the problem of the COVID-19 at the beginning was that they put health measures, immediately lockdown, and they forgot about the importance of the food value chain. And the sector reacted to that, and there was a lot of efforts to try to tell the world that we need to keep the food value chains alive because people need to eat. No matter that we are locked down, we need to eat. So, and that was resolved. And that uncertainty creates some issues in policies, which I will explain later, but now it's resolved. So similar to the situation during the second half of 2019-2020 season, the food markets are expected to confront important uncertainties beyond their own fundamentals, and also in 2021. The macroeconomic concerns, in particular weak economic growth prospects, developments in energy and currency markets, along with continued trade tensions, not to mention uncertainties associated in Africa swine fever, which is the reason why of the purchase of more pork meat from China, and also the desert locust. Desert locust, the problem right now, we have controlled it. It doesn't arrive to West Africa, but it still is in East Africa, in the Sahel. The problem is that it's coming back to Kenya again. So that could increase again the risk of the presence of desert locust, which basically can destroy significant amounts of production. However, the prospects are good, really good for 20. So we are not worried about food availability. So for me, the conclusion on staples is food is available. If we look at high value commodities, the situation is similar. There were a lot of logistical problems at the beginning. Why? Because high value commodities depend on labor force, and there was the lockdowns, which didn't allow the labor force to move. Second, they are more perishable, so any delays in transportation costs will affect them. And that created some pressure over the sector, which initially put some constraints, but now most of it has been controlled. The companies, the private sector has been very active in working with governments to allow food to flow, and that has resolved the problem. So supply chain disruptions during COVID-19, as I mentioned, the shortages of labor, the transportation issues, lower capacity utilization of processing facilities. This is a big problem today, especially for high value commodities, the packaging, the processing. That's where the jobs are at risk. And that's what happened with the meat sector in the US and in Germany and in England. It was because people were too close to each other, and that created the problem, and that's what we need to be aware now. And international disruptions in logistical disruptions. One of the major problems in logistical disruptions, which still is pending to resolve, is the issue of the vessels' crews. So in the countries in orange, the vessels still cannot be changed, and that's a problem because countries in North Africa, for example, are net food importers. Argentina is a huge exporter of staples, and Peru and Colombia are huge exporters of high-value commodities. Now, what this means is that crews, which have a maximum of 6 to 9 months to have their crew in the sea, if they cannot switch their vessels soon in those countries, they could disrupt the mobility of food. So that's something that we are putting a lot of pressure to governments, working with them to try to find ways in which they can put food safety health measures in the ports. Because basically what it means, testing the people that you are switching, if they are infected, you have to quarantine them. But they shouldn't be disrupting the movement, and there has been joint statements to try to support that. Trade restrictions was a problem at the beginning. There were 20 countries putting trade restrictions, 22 countries, sorry. This immediately reduced, but even with the 22, we were talking about 5% of the share of the global trade. In 2007-2008, there were 33 countries, and which implied 20% of the global trade. Very different. But now this 22 is zero, basically. So the share of the exports right now affected by trade restrictions is close to zero. Very minimal effects of exports. And this was export quotas, and some limited numbers put some export restrictions. But again, this is now resolved, and we need to keep, these are risks still there, but we need to keep putting transparency of information to the world to assure that things are okay. There were some measures to encourage imports. Several countries lower import barriers, mainly in the form of suspending import tariffs. And that's basically to increase and reduce prices to local producers. And also TBT, technical barriers, were lowered. And most measures were temporary, which was okay. All of these are established and resolved. But what is important is that one of the solutions, at least that we are foreseeing, is that we need to increase intra-regional trade. And non-tariff barriers are something that is creating a barrier to move food, and especially in Africa. And that's why we are pursuing and pushing for the Pan-African Food Safety Agency to be able to resolve that. And then there were the typical policies of price controls in the countries that we are trying to bring evidence to try to minimize those. And the major problems we are seeing in prices, because we are tracking prices real time, is in the protected crisis countries. No, we have 55 countries in crisis, but some of them are really in a significant problem because of conflict. And in those, basically, the situation of the lockdown exacerbated a little bit more the situation. But clearly, what we have seen today is that on the supply side, we need to be alert about the production and having the health. So our position is you have to have food, health, and food, and development has to be together. That triology, we cannot allow it to not happen, because we are reactivating the economy with COVID-19 there and a potential second wave, which is already starting in many parts. So we need to put the health protocols to be able to keep the food value chain alive. If not, we run the risk that we will close the food value chain because of health reasons. And that's not what we want to happen. No? So we need to keep alert on logistical. We are tracking real time movement of people and avoid any potential effects from existing crises. On the demand side, that's the big problem. No? We are going to face a huge recession. IMF says minus 4.8 GDP decline, GDP growth decline, significant potential increases in poverty. The bank is saying more than $100 million, 100 million people moving to extreme poverty. IFPRI is saying something similar. That's a huge problem. So food access is the problem. Food availability is not the problem. Food access is the problem. And this could affect consumption patterns, because people could eat lighter diets, and that could create an effect over quality of diets, and of course on overweight and obesity. So we need to really focus this and strengthen this to avoid a huge problem in terms of demand. And that's where the safety nets programs play a role, but also on doing productive projects that will allow us to reactivate the demand. By, for example, doing public works that is linked to productive activities, so that we invest in something that pay off rather than just supplying subsidies. And that's really important, because what you want to avoid is this scenario, no? The scenario where we could have 132 more million people undernourished in the world because of COVID-19. We are basically running 3 scenarios, but the worst is 132 million. That is putting us completely out of achieving SDG 2. And that's what we have to try to avoid. So what are the lessons learned? Just to finish, we need to urgently to accelerate food and agriculture system transformation. So business as usual doesn't work. These meat plants productions, people next to each other, no matter we put plastic barriers, that doesn't work, and that will change substantially. That will move towards automatization, and that means that we need to create the labor supply that has the skills to respond to that automatization. And this is basically going to affect differently females to males, because most of the food packaging, processing, and distribution is done by females, and that's where we need to be very careful. Digital technologies will play a crucial role, but they are not the panacea. If I want to do e-commerce, I need 4 things. I need, of course, the connectivity. I need the platform. I need mobile money, but I also need the capacity to move the goods. And that's where most developing countries fail. They don't have the mailing system. If you don't have the 4 things, it won't work. Africa has mobile money, can have some connectivity, can have the platform, but doesn't have the mailing system. So we need to prepare for that. International trade needs to move, because that's where we allocate resources efficiently. And we need to promote intra-regional trade. It's incredible that to buy a product, you have to go out of a continent, because it's more expensive than to buy it to the neighbor that produces the same product. That is even worse in the small islands, in Caribbean islands, for example, that are completely food import dependent. So we need to change that abruptly to be able to move ahead. Last but not least, COVID-19 has highlighted the critical importance of international collaboration and coordination. I think that's central. We need to collaborate and we need to coordinate, and we need to increase transparency. And I think this time we were prepared in terms of information on cereals. AMIS was able to push transparency of information, and that helped enormously for countries to respond and move back their policies of export restrictions. So with that, thank you very much, and sorry it took a little bit longer.
Can you underscore again, if it's not supply chain disruptions that are causing rising food insecurity today that we're seeing around the world, what are the major causes of rising food insecurity?
Of course, the increase in food insecurity, as I said, is not an issue of food availability. Food is available. It's an issue of food access. And why is that? It's because of we are living in a huge recession. A decline of GDP growth in minus 4.8% overall in the whole world, with developed countries having declines of 9 or 8%, and developing countries like Peru minus 14%. Okay, Africa, China only at 1%. It's a huge. We are not realizing how tough the situation will be. It's a lot worse than the previous recession. And that what means jobs. The first thing that falls is jobs. Now, of course, the developed countries have unemployment insurance. The developed countries have social security. No? So Europe, until the end of this month, have unemployment insurance. Now they are moving to social security. Now they are going to start to suffer. But developing countries are mostly informal economies. and they don't have that. They don't have that, so they are losing their capacity to buy food.
Yeah.
And up to now, they have been coping, but this is going to get into a critical situation, and that's why food insecurity could be increasing. Now,
Okay.
it is true that Africa is not as bad as we expected, because the level of COVID is not what we were expecting, only in the south and in the west. But in the east, it's okay. You have Tanzania with 500 cases. That has been great. They have been able to cope, but the problem is that they will have less demand for the produce. In what they live, Nigeria oil falling price. Many countries have gold falling price. Mali cotton falling in price. So they have a huge effect over the revenues. This year they were able to get some release because they are not paying the service of the debt, but next year they will start paying it again. So again, they are going to face the consequences of the recession, and that's where we need to find ways to resolve that.
Okay. I appreciated your comparison of the global food insecurity crisis we're experiencing today with the crisis we experienced in 2007, 2008. So after the 2007, 2008 crisis, the general approach that most donors in most countries accepted was to increase production, particularly of staple crops, which was appropriate given the nature of that crisis in 07, 08. So I think this is the million-dollar question, but what do you think should be the approach around which the global community coalesces to address food insecurity in this crisis?
No, what we will be observing, and we are already observing, staple production will remain good and high. That's what we observe. And why? Because there is the pressure of demand from China, which is basically allowing prices not to go down. They're basically stable, or some of them going up. And that's good in certain way. That's what I was saying, because that helps that we have the global supplies that we need. The major problem is what happens with production of high value commodities. No? And they will be facing a significant reduction in demand. And that's where we need to find ways in which we can assure that the next planting season is okay. For small holders, for medium holders, they are the ones that will be facing the major challenge, no? Because they won't be able to sell most of their produce. Most of it will be left in the field, which will increase losses. But they will have a problem of liquidity to plan for the next season. And that's where we need to find smart solutions. No? Like, for example, we were proposing the idea of central banks giving collaterals of 100% for smallholders. It's a one-year shot. You have to do it because that will assure liquidity to them. For large holders, you make competitive. You give less collateral. But for small holders, you have to find ways to give them the liquidity. And also to think smartly, you need to have capacity of increasing their resilience, like storage facilities. No? So we are working intensively in designing optimal locations of storage facilities in Africa so that farmers can store for a period of time their produce, no? Which we believe is important because that will allow them, and if we do it well, we can link them to the financial systems through warehouse receipt systems, and that will allow them to be able to have financial access, doing factoring with what they put in the warehouse.
Okay, thank you. Very much appreciate those responses. And of course, as you and I discussed earlier this week, those involved in food production are not the only ones at risk right now. So there are many people in many sectors experiencing food insecurity. So can you speak a little bit about how the food insecurity as experienced by people is different from what we saw in 07, 08?
Yeah, because the problem right now is that this is affecting everywhere. So the unemployment rates are mostly in peri-urban and urban areas. And that is what is creating new hotspots of food insecurity. We know how to handle food crisis countries. Those are in specific areas, no, of rural areas. Now the problem is in urban areas, in peri-urban areas, because that's where the bigger unemployment is happening. If you look at the food system and the jobs, it's around 1.2 billion jobs that we generate in the food system. And for 35% of it is at risk, 450 million jobs. That means like 1.2 billion livelihoods. Now, where are the major cuts are in packaging, processing, and delivery. 60% of those jobs are at risk. And these are in peri-urban areas because of electricity, because of energy. These are not in rural areas. So again, are mostly females also. So again, we need to figure out, because this is going to increase inequality substantially. And that's what we keep arguing. It's important to identify the new hotspots of food insecurity because it's not the traditional way. And we need to be smart on that because we need to target and prioritize safety nets or social protection programs, which have to be changed because we need to target, like, imagine the schools are closed. Kids cannot get food through the school. So we need to work with food banks to deliver food. So a lot of changes that has to allow us to move fast and change the way we used to do social protection. Okay.
Apologies for putting you on the spot, but have you seen any interventions that you think are particularly effective in light of the new nature of this challenge? You said that it's people in packaging, processing, delivery. those jobs in urban areas, many of them among women. Have you seen any smart interventions to address challenges among those populations?
Yeah, I have seen very good, like the US established one, which was good. Basically, they subsidize their high value producers, but they condition that to delivery to the food banks. So if you want to get the subsidy, you have to package the food and send it to the food banks, and then they deliver it to people. That's very smart. And that should be replicated around. It's a good option because what we'll have, and that's when I am saying, if I'm going to give a collateral for a small farmer producer of mangoes in Africa, I give him the collateral of 100%, but with the condition that he sells in the local market, because he won't be able to export. No? The mango, but instead of living in the tree, he should sell. So we put conditionalities, which will help to have more supply of healthy diets. So we need to find those type of solutions. We have also seen a huge job of food banks to replace the school delivery system. In many countries that has been starting to happen. We have seen significant solutions of private sector companies finding ways in which they can reduce the number of lines of production so that they can only sell, instead of 10, sell 3 lines of production, but being able to find the inputs for those so that they didn't stop producing. And in some cases, it has been very profitable. If I talk with companies in Africa and they don't feel the problem yet, they feel that they have demand. So again, things are okay, things are moving, but the recession is the problem. The recession that we're going to face, for me, is the problem. And we need to find solidarity also. No? Solidarity is crucial because all the pre-packages that we are delivering in the North countries of huge financial support, monetary policies, is going to affect the exchange rate. In certain ways, affecting developing countries that don't have that capacity. So just a 0.3% of tax to all those trillions of dollars that are being imposed could resolve our problem of food insecurity in the developing countries.
But have you seen any data on global food loss and waste rates during the pandemic?
So I can say something. Because I am working on a paper which I was supposed to deliver, but I couldn't finish. But so what we are seeing, so the rate of food loss right now, the food loss index that FAO developed is 14%. That's the level of losses. No? Losses, not waste. Losses is from post-harvest to wholesale included. Waste is from retail to consumer. So in terms of losses, what we are seeing, if you apply the potential rates of elasticities given the reduction in demands, is that it could be, I cannot give an exact figure, but it could increase, especially pre-harvest, so in left in the field, what we call left in the field. And that will happen mostly in high-value commodities, where the loss rate in high-value commodities by itself is a lot higher than the staples, so it's around 30%. So that's where we are expecting increases. On waste, we observe some increase at the beginning, but then the increase started to smooth out because consumers start to figure out how to buy. So they were not buying anymore for panic buying that was the initial case. No? So not exact numbers yet, they will come, but potential increase, significant potential increase in left in the field. So even before the post-harvest.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for that. Related to this is another question, which is with the loss of diversity in foods and the loss of high value / nutritious foods, what nutritional deficiencies do you think that people are most susceptible to in the time of COVID? I imagine the answer differs region to region, but do you have a sense of that, of the types of malnutrition we might see because of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Before COVID-19, we had 3 billion people that didn't have access to healthy diets, and the definition of healthy diets is in addition to a nutrition diet, to have the minimum nutrition components, to have diversity of the diet, and that's what makes each region differently. Now, we don't know yet because for the people that could have access, so there will be a big group of people that won't have access, and that's the problem, okay? And that's where we need to work and to innovate so that we give them ways to have access, especially of good diets. But for the ones who will stay having access, the situation could change because if there is more supply because of the lack of exports, because of the lower demand of developed countries, then it could be that local prices of those commodities could reduce. And that means that healthy diets could become more affordable. So you could have a different effect than what you normally would have expected. But if that is not the case and the supply side adjusts immediately and reduce the production, which is difficult in trees. So for fruits, it's very difficult because you cannot stop producing in trees. Yeah. It's more easy for vegetables, okay? That could be something different. So again, the diversity could be affected, but if the income is the real income goes substantially down as we expect, then what we expect is a shift towards staple foods, which means more overweight, more obesity, more NCDs. No?
Sure, okay. I do have another question about market transparency. dig into the final point of Maximo's presentation, what are some specific steps we can do to increase the type of transparency that you think we need right now, Maximo, in food trade and food supply chains?
Yeah, so we need to keep pushing and having the more detailed information on the stocks, because right now we know public stocks. There is still some uncertainty in the stocks that some Asian countries have. So we need to reduce that uncertainty, but especially there is a lot of information that we need on private stocks. So private sector stocks, that will help a lot to calm markets. The second element is, which basically we were able to resolve, is real-time vessel information, mobility of vessels and what they were moving across borders. That has to become more public and more high frequency real time so that people can look at what is happening. And lastly, keep improving in the capacity to project harvest and to understand how good the harvest is. And for that, digital technologies have evolved substantially. Right now, we have a geospatial platform in FAO, the hand-in-hand geospatial platform, that is allowing us to have a better idea in real time of what is the potential harvest at the micro level of the country, which is important. But we need to keep improving. We don't have all the countries of the world. But again, we need to keep innovating to bring as much information as possible into the markets.
Okay, thank you. So take your point about we need to keep innovating to bring new information, but there are existing platforms to promote transparency in ag markets. For example, one that was set up by the G20 about 10 years ago. So do you think it's the case that we can simply use platforms that already exist, or should we be creating new ones for the sake of this new crisis?
No, so that is AMIS, Agricultural Market Information System. That's the one I am referring. So that is, we are boosting it more because, for example, AMIS never had logistical information. Now AMIS have real-time mobility of vessels information. So we need to keep boosting it. But even AMIS that collects reserves and have been working intensively to have the idea of what are the stocks, we still have problems in certain Asian countries of uncertainty of that information. So the more we can empower those initiatives that worked, the better it will be.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Maximo. I have a question right now on the overlapping crises that we're seeing in some places. So some places are seeing some supply chain disruptions along the lines of the ones that you've explained. We're seeing locust swarms in East Africa. We're seeing the impacts of climate change in various ways in different parts of the world. So what, all these things happening at the same time as the pandemic. So if you could just speak a bit about the overlapping nature of the crises that we're seeing right now, and considering these other impacts, do these other impacts change the recommendations you're giving going forward?
So the major problem that we're facing in Africa, in Eastern Africa, is the locust, and also the fall armyworm. Those are the big problems in Africa. In Asia is the African swine fever, which still is there and is important. But then you have, of course, COVID-19. Now, in the case of the locust, which is a problem, the issue there is to resolve the problem, and that means being able to put in place all the mechanisms to control the plagues, and that's what is being tried. But once the plagues are big and the swarms are big, it's very complex and very expensive. For the future, what we need to do and what we need to have is very, very, very good early warning mechanisms with predictive power. So FAO was lucky because FAO had a unit that has been working on locusts for the whole life, and they were world experts on the topic, but the governments didn't react at the velocity they were alerting, and they didn't have the tools that they have today. So in the last year, we have been able to build tools that allows them to model and to simulate the mobility of the swarms. That's how they were able to predict the mobility towards Western Africa, and they were able to control it. And that's how now they know that the swarms are coming back to Kenya, and they are trying to avoid that to happen. So again, those type of tools that give you some predictive power are central. The other thing is that we need to start innovating a lot and bringing technology to resolve problems like fall armyworm. It's unacceptable that we have such levels of fall armyworm. And there are other issues like TR4 for the banana, which is like the cancer for the banana, and we need to find a solution to that. So again, or the Rust coffee for Central America. Again, what we understand from all this is that the surprise element will be there and will continue to be there and will continue to appear with a higher frequency. So we need to build a food system which is resilient. And that's what we need to have in place. And that means giving farmers the capacity to cope with this type of shocks in a better way. Of course, it will never be the best optimal, but it will allow them at least to cope better than what they have today.
Okay. In the long term, should we expect a reconfiguration of food trade with an increase in domestic and regional trade at the expense of long distance trade? And if so, can this lead to increased production and consumption of more nutritious but perishable food? But I want to focus on that first question. So do you think that an effect of this pandemic is that we'll see a trend toward local and regional trade at the expense of global trade?
You want me to give a first shot at that quickly, and then you can...
Yes, if you don't mind, since we're already talking.
So what we know today is that the commodity that moves the less distance in trade is vegetables, okay? Fruits and staples move the largest, then fruits, and then meats and fish. Vegetables can be produced locally, and they will be produced close to cities. That's what we are seeing now. That's the transformation of COVID-19. Why? Because you can do control environments, and they are cost effective. That is going to happen. It's already happening across the world. But in the case of fruits, it's close to impossible. If you want to have fruits available, you have different seasons, different time zones, that you can not do that today in controlled environments. The same with fish, meat, and staples are specialized. So I don't expect that to happen for those commodities. Now, that we have global trade is great, because basically we can reassign and we can optimize the use of the natural resources. That we need to have more interregional trade? Yes, we need to increase interregional trade. That's a coping mechanism. That's increasing resilience of countries. But by no means we should be reducing global trade to increase interregional trade. That should be a mistake, I think, in my personal opinion.
Okay. With increasing food insecurity in urban and peri-urban areas, what would be potential interventions? Maximo, you've already given one example, but I'm wondering if you can give some more. And an additional question is, does the FAO have plans to engage in urban areas?
Yes. So I think the first thing is that we need to know where they are, where these food insecurity hotspots are. We are doing enormous efforts to develop and deploy our food insecurity experience scale for a short-term period of recall in 3 rounds. We right now have the resources to do it in like 20 countries. That's important because donors don't realize of how important it is. And this was a small call, but we couldn't get the resources to do it across the world. We were doing it for 100 countries. That's something that I think is essential. The second thing is there are mechanisms of safety net programs that you need to put in place. No? So normally these are cash transfers, which we know they are very effective if they are well targeted. We cannot put conditionalities because there are no schools, there are no health centers working normally. And second, public works programs. And I am very inclined towards public works programs because that will help us, if they are done properly, to target the public works site. So the people you are helping will get a wage, but the public works site to productive projects. Is FAO going to work in urban areas? FAO works in urban areas, in peri-urban areas. We work in the rural-urban continuum, and we have developed this initiative of green cities, which is basically trying to work with municipalities to bring green areas, agriculture to the cities. So we are intensively designing that. We have a big program called the Green Cities that was launched in New York 2 weeks ago. So yes, we are starting to do that, but our major focus, of course, is agriculture and rural areas and trying to work in this continuum. Remember, the agricultural system is value chains crosses rural because electricity is mostly in urban, and the processing plants, the packaging plants are in peri-urban, urban areas. So that's how it works.
What actions can we take now as we rebuild our economies and supply chains to make our food systems writ large more resilient to the next crisis, whatever the next crisis is?
So I think it's core to increase the resilience of the food systems, and one of the major elements for that is we have 4 pillars for that in FAO. So it's data, high frequency data, big data, so that we know what is happening and transparency is increased. Using technology, innovation, and good governance. I think good governance is central to what we do because if we don't have the good governance in place, digital technologies won't be a solution, will be a problem. And we need to have that in place. And in that, infrastructure is core. We know that building infrastructure, but designing it properly. The problem we have is that we build infrastructure where it was in the past. We upgrade what we had in the past. And if we want to change the way we produce, we need to build infrastructure to link the productive sectors, the areas with potential, to link them to the markets. And that's a different way of looking at infrastructure.
It is. So, and I imagine you're talking about infrastructure writ large, digital infrastructure, roads, bridges, et cetera. You're talking about all types?
Yeah, there is infrastructure, the hard infrastructure and the soft infrastructure. No? So, but the most important right now is for me to create the linkages on the storage facilities, so more the value chain type of infrastructure that will provide capacity to farmers to be able to cope with the situation. And of course, roads are central. But sometimes, trucks can move. They will take more time. But sometimes they take from in the 2 kilometers to get to the main road, it takes 5 hours. And that's a small, cheap road that you can build a rural penetration road. And that's where we need to be more smart in to have this network perception.